Nothing you're about to hear should be taken as or used in place of medical advice. If you resemble anything you hear, contact your doctor. If you want to know what Walgreens thinks, ask them, because we don't know. Please wait behind the line for privacy.
You're listening to the Pharmacist Answers podcast. I'm Cynthia, the pharmacist, and today you'll get your questions answered and your curiosity cured. I've got a list of a couple of things that are common hair problems that you can have. One of the main problems that people get concerned about their hair is it falling out. Oh my goodness, my hair is falling out. So there's a couple of different reasons why hair falls out. There's a condition called alopecia, and I call it the crop circle balding, but essentially your hair falls out in like little circle patches, but they really don't know why. There's probably a genetic component to it, but not exactly sure what about the genetic tells all of the hair follicles in that one spot to lose the hair all at the same time. Kind of like crop circles. The whole little spot falls out altogether, and then those hair follicles will go through their life cycle and then grow hair back. But the alopecia is those little splotches. The life cycle of hair follicles, there's 3 stages of your hair follicles. One is the Anagen phase, the Catagen phase, and the Telogen phase. The Anagen phase is the active phase, so that's when the cells are actively multiplying. They're actively absorbing nutrients from your bloodstream and the capillaries that feed the follicle, and so the hair is actively growing and multiplying and pushing the shaft further out for your hair to get longer. So Anagen, active, A for active. The Catagen phase is the one in the middle, and it's the resting phase. So the hair is there, everything's attached. It's just kind of being maintained by the nutrients in the bloodstream, but not a whole lot of cell division going on. And some of it has to do with the density of hair follicles in your scalp. If you have lots of hair follicles, then you're going to have lots of hair. And also genetics determine the thickness of your hair. So that's the size of the opening of your hair follicles. The bigger the opening, then the thicker that hair strand is going to be coming out. So the Catagen phase, that's the resting phase. It's still getting nutrition, but it's not in this active cell dividing method. So the Catagen, I think of it as a cat nap. So that's the resting phase. Catagen is the resting phase because it's taking a cat nap. Okay? It's cute. That's how I remember it. So then the Telogen phase is the shedding phase. Telling them bye. Is hair made out of the same stuff as fingernails? Yes, sort of. Hair and fingernails are made out of a protein called keratin. So when the cells die, the body essentially embalms them, sort of, by filling it up with keratin. And so then it becomes hard. The alpha keratin, that's your hair, is more soft and flexible. The beta keratin, which is not the same as beta carotene, but beta keratin is what makes your fingernails and makes it really, really hard. So the telogen phase is the phase where your hair is actually shedding. So if you have a massive exodus of hair, then that just means a whole lot of your hair follicles went into that telogen phase all at one time. So with alopecia, unexplainably, all of those cells go into that shedding phase all at the same time, and so you end up with like patches of emptiness. So then 2 types of regular normal balding. There's male pattern baldness and female pattern baldness. Male pattern baldness is the receding of the hairline. So your hairline starts here, and so for men who are aging and they bald, then the cells, all of the hair follicles kind of all in a line, start to die off, and so the hair recedes. Also, male pattern baldness is the loss of the crown. And so for all of our royalty in our group, to lose your crown, that would be sad. But that's male pattern baldness, is the receding hairline and the crown disappearance. For female pattern balding is just an overall thinning. Yes, can't lose your crown. It's an overall thinning of hair. So the density of hair follicles that are actually actively producing hair and holding on to their hair the density is just thinner. And so there's a condition called hirsutism that is where females get male pattern balding because of a testosterone imbalance. So they'll get the male pattern balding with the receding hairline, some crown loss, but they'll also grow like the facial hair, like men facial hair. And it's called hirsutism. Hirsutism is when females get male pattern balding. And then there was the question that I got yesterday that I wanted to go back and answer about why does all of your hair seem like it's falling out after you have a baby. There is a condition called Telogen effluvium. And if you look up the definition of the word effluvium, it sounds really bad. It's an expulsion of bad odor or discharge or whatever. Like that's the medical term, the medical definition for it. I'm like, oh, that sounds terrible. But that's really not what happens. But back to the life cycle of your hair follicles in that telogen phase, it just means that a whole lot of your hair follicles go into the telogen phase at the same time. So you have a massive discharge of your hair falling out. And so that can happen when your body goes through an extreme shock. And while adrenaline and all the endorphins that we get from different situations can help us in that moment. So, for example, having a baby. There's a lot of adrenaline going on. There's a lot of hyperactive in the body to be able to, like, we're getting this baby out and you have the baby. A lot of that adrenaline can overstimulate the cells, and so then once it's over, they're like, oh, we're tired, we don't want to do anything else. So then your cells will automatically drop down into kind of this resting or dormant stage where they're not wanting to divide to recuperate from that adrenaline rush that it had with having a baby. So that means a lot of your cells in your body kind of reach that, oh, we're exhausted stage, and so then the hair will shed. So that's the explanation for that. Hair growth does have some to do with hormones, mostly because certain hormones will determine what areas of your body hair grows. So like testosterone causes hair to grow on your face. So males get facial hair, body hair like arm hair and leg hair get darker. And so some of it has to do with hormones, but most of it has to do with just that full system shock from that dramatic biological event. And so the whole body just goes, oh, we're tired, this was hard. For it to be able to recuperate, it'll go through that resting phase, and so a lot of hair will fall out because of that. Now for ladies who are postpartum and they actually get there is a condition called postpartum alopecia, which is essentially the effluvium of the hair, that massive exodus of hair in patches like alopecia would look. But once the body recovers, then it grows back. And then the other thing that can affect your hair is there's two things. One is dandruff. And dandruff is essentially caused by the inflammation of the scalp. So if you have inflammation on any other part of your skin, the skin tends to be dry and itchy because the inflammation messes with the balance of all the nutrients that go to that skin. So the skin tends to die off faster and it'll get itchy and possibly flaky. So if you have prolonged inflammation in your scalp, then the scalp isn't getting the nutrients it needs, and so it can tend to have that inflammation and get that itchy feeling the way other inflamed skin can. And so as it starts flaking, then obviously those flakes of skin show up in your hair. And then the other thing is called tinea capitis, and that is the fancy name for ringworm that grows on your scalp. If you get ringworm on like your arm, it's just called ringworm, or it's called tinea corpus because it's the fungal infection of the body. Tinea capitis is the fungal infection of your head. And so with that fungal, just like a ringworm, you get the dry, red, flaky in a circle, and there's obviously no worm involved. You'll get the red flakies in your scalp, and then those hair follicles, because they're infected, they will lose their hair, and so it can lead to baldness in those little spots. So you treat the fungus and get rid of the ringworm thing, and then the hair will grow back. Some of the life cycle of the hair follicles can last like years and years and years, and that's obviously why people can like grow insanely long hair, because that hair goes through that multiplying and that active growing stage for a really long time, up to 6 years before it gets tired and says, oh, I need a cat nap, and moves on to the next phase. Kind of encouraging, so you know that that your hair is doing what it needs to do. Just one last little fact is that because your hair is made up of dead cells, then the DNA in those cells is kind of mummified, so they can identify people and get a DNA sample from hair. Like, that's like a whole CSI thing, being able to identify people from hair. But in a practical sense, they'll try to use hair sometimes for paternity tests if they're trying to identify kids. Sometimes it's easier to like do a cheek swab, and they'll do that too, but they can actually do paternity tests from the cells in your hair because the DNA is there. The other thing about the hair, if you've had prolonged exposure to something like a toxin, does dyeing hair mess with the DNA at all, or bleaching? No. Dyeing and perming essentially affect the protein connection, so it doesn't actually mess with the DNA inside. The keratin proteins that make up the hair shaft, the protein connections kind of hold it together, and so, for instance, perm chemicals will kind of make them floppy and like all loosey-goosey, and then they'll use the rollers and roll it up and then let them harden back up. And so then when you take the roller out, those protein bonds have hooked themselves back together in a different shape. So that's how that works. The dyeing just has to do with how the chemicals affect the melanin proteins that get deposited in your hair. To bleach it out, those proteins get bleached and they're not gonna necessarily earn their color back. But also, dyeing means that you've taken those proteins and added a chemical color back to them. And so that doesn't really affect the DNA of the cells. But if you've been exposed to toxins for a prolonged period of time, prolonged exposure to carbon monoxide, prolonged exposure to like lead or mercury poisoning, or even if you smoked and then you stopped, that prolonged exposure to all of those chemicals and the nicotine show up in your hair. And so even in the dead cells, they can look, if there was a time where you were exposed and then a time when you were like chemical free, then they can look and see and actually get a timeline of your exposure based on your hair, because the cells that died during the time that you were exposed to those chemicals that then got keratinized, they hold on to the characteristics of the damage that those chemicals did. So they can identify lead poisoning, they can identify mercury poisoning and other heavy metals, they can identify carbon monoxide poisoning that way, whether it's from poor living conditions or work conditions or the habit of smoking. They can identify if there was illicit drug use like marijuana or cocaine or other things that get smoked. They can identify those things, that chemical fingerprint in your hair, and based on how your hair grows, they can kind of get a timeline to know when exactly that exposure happened, when it started, how long it happened, and then when it stopped, if it ever did. Now, obviously, if that fingerprint makes it all the way to the end of your hair where it's inside your scalp, then it's possible that you're still getting that exposure. Some people know, some people don't, but that is an easy way that they can do that. So it's really neat. Your hair says a lot about you, even though the cells down here are already dead. They're kind of mummified and have a distinct fingerprint of that time in your life of what was happening to you. I think that's about it. Have a good day. Bye.
Thanks for listening to the Pharmacist Answers podcast. The pharmacy is now closed. You can post your questions and comments on our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/pharmanswerspod. Or you can email the show at pharmacistanswershere@gmail.com. You can tweet me or message me on Twitter @SinHendrix. You can find the show notes at pharmacistanswershere.wordpress.com. Pharmacist Answers broadcasts live on Monday, Wednesday, and Thursday at 9:02 a.m. Eastern Time on the Periscope app. You can follow me at Sin Hendrix or view in your web browser at periscope.tv/Sin Hendrix. See you next time on the Pharmacist Answers podcast.